Welcome, everybody, to the Healing Place podcast. I am your host, Teri Wellbrock, and happy to have you here with me today. And I'm super happy to have Anna Runkle here, the crappy childhood fairy. Yay!
Thanks, Teri. I like having the word crappy right before my
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's so phenomenal because it's one of those, like you remember it,
Yeah, it came to me one day. Yeah. I can't find a better way to describe it.
Right. Sadly, but true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, talk to us about what it is you do and, the crappy childhood fairy role.
Well, so I grew up in a family that had a lot of alcoholism, and then it had a lot of the problems that come with alcoholism. We were very poor. We were on welfare. My mom was the main alcoholic. There were others. My older brother. Probably half the people in my whole family have serious alcoholism or drug addiction. And actually the ones who did have died of it. So I'm not really at the effect of people actively drinking or using drugs anymore. I'm just at the effect of what happened to me as a kid. So I'm 55 years old right now. When I was 30, I was starting to really fall apart over this. I had some really good coping strategies early on. As a kid I was the oldest daughter, I was really good at taking care of younger kids. I started a business when I was 9. By the time I was 15, I had 5 businesses. I was really industrious. I got perfect grades. In my 20s, I was sort of running that like perfect accomplishment thing for a while. And I think this is not uncommon. In my late 20s, it started to fall apart, mainly around my relationships with other people. You can only try to achieve stuff to a certain degree. It's not going to make you a wonderful friend or girlfriend. And I was starting to have a really dark, hard edge about me. It was very self-centered. It was really hard for me back then to hear other people or pay attention to them. And so in my blog, I've described this before. I drew a picture of it. And it's funny, I'm wearing headphones right now, but I say that when my childhood PTSD was in full bloom, it was as if I was wearing headphones with AC/DC, heavy metal blasting in my ears all the time and trying to pretend that nothing was happening. And I could barely hear what other people were saying. I was very out of touch with the emotional tenor of what was happening, hard for me to read emotions. And then I would just have these huge reactions to things. A friend of mine calls it my airplane. My airplane. When my brain is regulated, my emotions are like an airplane. If something upsets me, it kind of comes up off the ground gradually. When my PTSD is unregulated, it's like my airplane just shoots up like the space shuttle into space. I just I leave myself and have this intense reaction. And in that space, I'll say things I don't mean, and I'll get this intense urge that I have to resolve this thing right now. And so I've heard a lot of relationships that way. And I'm saying this as if it's going on right now. And I would just say that at this point, it's barely going on. I wouldn't say that I'm ever cured or that everything's perfect, but through understanding that what I have is a neurological injury from neglect as a small child and some stuff that went on. It's mostly neurological. I've come to think it's somewhat psychological, and then part of it is just being a person. Everybody's a little bit screwed up, right?
Right.
So I've learned how to re-regulate my brain, and it was until I could understand how to do that, until I understand this is PTSD. It's not just your garden variety tough childhood. I have a problem staying regulated. Once I learned that, I realized that I had known all along how to re-regulate, but I hadn't put together, when I feel like this, do this.
Right.
And I think all of us, we do all get dysregulated sometimes, and we all know how to re-regulate, but we just don't always know how to do it as quickly and fully as we need to.
Right.
So when I learned that, all of a sudden, all the advice people had given me all my life, all the help therapists had tried to provide, it finally could reach me. And I was like, that's what they were saying. Because I used to sit in therapy offices and they'd be like, wow, that sounds really bad. And then what happened? And you were left in the snow and you were only 6 and that's terrible. Well, then I would just flood with emotion. I would just become I've read the research.
Right.
When we are having that PTSD reaction, left frontal cortex goes dark, right frontal cortex goes, "Wah!" So it's very little reasoning, lots of emotion.
That's what I was just going to say. That whole left brain, right brain separation thing happens. And there, logically, like there's a part of me that almost can hear the screaming of my logical brain saying, wait a minute, but I can't hear it, and I get what you're saying. Like, I can't hear that logical part. And it's just like, what do you say? What?
It's some wise woman on a far shore saying, can you hear me? You're like, ah.
Right.
Yeah, it's very intense. And I just remember the terrible pain of, like, I'd have some sort of intense rage reaction at somebody. It would all seem very necessary and appropriate at the time. And then an hour later, I'd just go, oh boy, what have I done? And I didn't have very good tools for what to do then. And, part of how I've recovered from childhood PTSD is learning how to apologize to people when I do overreact as quickly and with as much emotional intelligence as I possibly can. So all of this stuff I had to learn. I kind of had to teach myself. I pieced it together from little pieces that other people taught me. But I just think, like, once you get this piece where you learn how to re-regulate, everything is possible.
Yes.
And now I walk around. I live in Berkeley, California. We have a lot of homeless people here. We have a lot of mentally ill people on the street, very visibly mentally ill. Yeah. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, and I go up to people who are talking to themselves and I say, hey, did you have a really rough childhood? And they're like, yes, honey, I am schizophrenic now, but what happened when I was a kid is blah, blah, and they tell me a story. I'm like, see?
Yeah.
The code has been cracked. I don't think we've figured it all out yet, but we have cracked the code here of what is going on with so many of the problems we have.
Right.
I'm confident my intelligence has gone up. I was a very intelligent little kid. I felt like when the PTSD was on me, I used to feel like somebody who had, like a big cloud had come over my intelligence. I used to remember being very sharp, and I wasn't, and I'm sharp again.
Right. What's interesting is you were talking, and I had an alcoholic mother, a violent father for my first 10 years. My dad did end up getting therapy, and I remember him sitting me on his knee when I was 10 and apologizing and saying, I will never hit you again. I hit you out of anger, and he never did. But wow. Yeah, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful healing moment. But with my mom, and I started my own cleaning business when I was 10 years old, cleaning apartments, and we lived in an apartment complex. So you're talking, and I was like, oh my gosh, I did the same thing. I was that straight A student, I tried to be the perfect child. I was the oldest daughter. So yeah, I get it. I get what you were saying.
Wow. We should have been friends.
I know, right?
We're friends now. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, it's funny, as a little aside. So I went to my high school reunion for the first time in 2011. It was my 30th reunion. I went to high school in Tucson, Arizona. And when I left high school a year early. I was such a good student. I graduated a year early, and then I got out of Dodge. I moved to San Francisco, and I never went back, and I didn't stay in touch with anybody. And then Facebook came, and right. I started having some relationships again with the friends of the time, and we got together for a reunion. And then I talked to my little circle of girlfriends, and it turned out we all had that going on, and we never talked openly about it. We didn't realize that really about each other. We all thought we were the only one, but we all had at least one parent who was addicted or alcoholic, right. And or dead.
Oh.
And so everybody had a hard time. And then we caught up, like, well, then what happened to you after high school? And all of us had a tough road for a while.
Right. Which is why that's so, so, so cool that ACEs is coming.
Yes.
The knowledge about it. I mean, thank you, Oprah, for that interview and kind of bringing it into the mental health scene, but now it's, going beyond the scope of the mental health scene. And just making everyone aware of the impact of resilience building skills and helping children who are living in a difficult home, a difficult situation, and how we can help build resilience in that child, and help educate the parents as to the impact they're having on the children.
Yeah.
And healing parents, and then who can then, kind of stop the vicious cycle. So Yeah.
Do you feel like, are you seeing progress in that? Because quite honestly, I think, gosh, how on earth are you going to stop it from happening? Could anybody have done anything about what happened to me? I don't know.
Right. Yeah. And I do. I mean, I have hope for it like, I look at my story and all the, I have gone through, but then I think, I'll tell people my story and then they're like, how do you smile? How are you happy? Like, how do you radiate this joy? And then I think, oh, Grandma Kitty, my grandma was such a loving, calming presence in my life. And so that resilience factor.
Yes.
So again, what you were talking about, like just starting to get it as a society. And if we can more and more get it and make sure people are in children's lives that help them have that resilience.
Okay. You're really inspiring me right now. I had Grandma Ree, and and she picked me up every day after school, and she knew what was going on in my house. Yeah. And I'm learning more about her history, and she had kind of been through it too. And she lost her husband in 1941, which was a tough time. And she had just had twins.
Oh my goodness.
And she was widowed during the war with little baby twins, and she was 40 years old, and she was a social worker. She had a rough road. So she knew, and she was the kindest, sweetest person. And actually, I was reminded of her really deeply when I saw the Mr. Rogers movie, Won't You Be My Neighbor? Did you see that?
I haven't seen it yet, but I want to, yes.
So he was one of my angels, for sure. She would say, you don't need to watch TV. It's too frenetic. I know you see this stuff that's really crazy on TV, and it gets you all amped up.
I don't watch TV for that reason.
I love TV too.
Yes.
I'm a video maker. I have an excuse. But I love TV. I have no doubt it's triggering. But for kids, it's generally kind of a rough thing. But I'm as a 4 or 5-year-old watching crazy hectic cartoons where people are getting bonked over the head. Well, my parents were beating the crap out of each other at home. And so I just remember her saying that, and now I'm putting it together. And I heard Fred Rogers in the documentary saying, kids don't need to see all this violence. I think it's very disturbing to them. A lot of them are going through a lot at home, and they need to just see. I remember the calming feeling of watching him. He'd come in the door, he'd shut the door, he'd walk down the stairs, he'd take off his sweater, he'd hang up the sweater, he'd take out the shoes, he'd take off his current shoes, he'd put the new shoes on, put the shoes away, he'd go to the fishbowl. It was re-regulating me. I just loved that, and I love somebody talking really quiet to me. And so
quiet. That's a powerful part of it.
Yeah, and in a measured manner, and loving me. She loved me so much, and that was of course my parents loved me, but when they're not there for 3 months at a time, how do you know as a kid? So that is why, and I see now the hope of the whole movement is that if more of us could be those grandmas or those friends or aunties or neighbors, because also I'll tell you, the moms, I had several childhood friends, and their mothers had their eye on me. They'd be like, how would you like to come stay at my house? I had a friend, we found each other on Facebook. I said, did you know my mom was an alcoholic? We hadn't seen each other since we were 6. Did you know that? And she said, yes, we knew. My mother told me about it later. You came to our house one night at 3 a.m. and you said that your dad had a knife and wouldn't let your mom out of the bathroom.
Yeah.
And I don't remember that, but at 3 a.m. I went to their house, just went down the street about half a block, and they said, yeah, stay over here. And however they handled it, it all seemed so fine that I don't even have a memory of it. It just made it seem like everything's cool. We got you.
Yeah. And it was your normal. So it probably just processed that way in your head. Yeah.
Yeah. Another mom taught me to knit, took me to camp every year, paid for it. We were really poor.
Yeah.
And my parents were educated. They had owned a business, but because of what was going on, they had sort of spiraled down to the bottom of the economic ladder, if not the socio ladder. So, these are people who helped me. And there were also great teachers who saw what was going on. Back in the day, you couldn't do this now. School is so legalistic, I guess, but I have a sister 6 years younger. And so when I was in 3rd grade and she was a toddler, she would just come to school with me all day long. She'd go get lunch in the cafeteria with me, and the teachers were just like, oh, yeah, just.
Wow.
And they brought her in. People knew what was going on, and they looked out for us. And so.
That's what I'm talking about. You know, having teachers, having coaches.
Yeah.
The more that we become aware of the impact, and it can be the smallest of impacts. I remember my 2nd grade teacher, Mrs. Corkin, and I could walk to her house. You know, here I was 7 years old, and it was a couple streets away, but I would walk to her house and just sit on her front porch with her. To this day, I still have a little ceramic heart. And how interesting that I find hearts everywhere. Like, that's my thing. I found a heart today on the sidewalk and took a picture.
Wow.
A little ceramic heart, and you know, it opens, and I had little knickknacks and stuff, but she gave that to me, and it was a treasure, and it was so simple, but I knew she had my back. And I don't know.
So there's some people who have a way of communicating it, because this is what I remember, and you may relate to this. I was so ashamed.
Yeah.
I didn't want people to know, and I didn't want to be acknowledged as a kid going through a hard thing. I was very ashamed. And on some level, starting at a young age, like I mentioned this, when I was 6, my mom we would go to the casinos up in Reno and Tahoe a lot. And then she would say, look, I'm just going to go in for like 10 minutes. So just wait here in this doorway. And I'll be right back. But, you know, she'd have a drink or something, right? And, you know, she had the disease of alcoholism. It was completely out of her control what happened after that. And so one time it was like 11 hours, or she dumped me in a movie theater or something.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was in a movie. I saw The Sound of Music 3 times in a row, and that movie's like 3.5 hours long.
Right.
And there's a half-hour break between, and there's an intermission.
Yeah, right.
And I didn't have any money. I didn't have any food, and on that day I had
popcorn. Right.
I had strep throat. It was, you know, I was like really neglected, and I wouldn't tell anybody because I was really afraid the cops were gonna. I just sort of knew, like, the police do something about this, don't they? And in those days, they didn't do as much as they do now.
Right.
And I've been involved in a family case where some kids were taken away from their parents for a while, and it's not like that's a perfect solution. I still would be terrified, I think, even though, you know, it's totally necessary and appropriate sometimes. But it was when that happened to the kids in my family, it was really devastating for everybody, the kids, the parents, and me trying to help out. And there's just no good solution when that happens, except, so what I'm getting at is those adults, the teachers, my grandmother, the parents of other kids who were able to help me and in some way tell my heart that they understood and they had my back without tipping me off that I should be ashamed, without, I don't know, I remember all of those people communicating to me that they thought I was a great kid.
Right.
I was like, yeah, I'm a great kid.
Yeah, there was no like that judgment thing. You just
yeah.
And there are those gentle people who just have a way of just loving you.
Yeah, and showing that respect. And I try to treat all kids with that respect too, and not just like, oh, you're not talk down to them, but try to pay attention to the sort of eternal human being inside them.
Yes, beautiful.
And talk to them.
Yes. So you've taken all this and you've turned it into this this business. I mean, the business of helping others. And so what is it that you have a course and you have a website and you do?
So I have a day job. I have a video production company that's its own thing. Every once in a while, I use the wrong email address with the clients, and they're like, "Crappy childhood fairy, what is that?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's this."
Sorry.
Well, do I tell them?
Right.
But that's another thing. I was ashamed as a kid, and even in my 20s and 30s, I had a very compartmentalized life. I had the part of me that was dealing with the past and the part of the face I put on for work, and I'm pretty much like the same person now. Wherever you meet me, I don't have a compartmentalized life, and that's a really nice thing too. But I have wanted to write a book about the techniques that have started to help me. I never really had a frame for it until I read Bessel van der Kolk's book. That book was the one that just sort of like opened my eyes to, this is a neurological injury. And I was like, yes, that's what it is.
That book all the time. You're talking about The Body Keeps the Score, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I've read a lot of other books, but that was the one that really like changed everything and finally spoke my language. And I had had EMDR before that, and that was really helpful. So here's the thing, Teri. I had this stuff happen when I was a kid, but I was re-traumatizing myself over and over again. I was having the classic self-defeating behaviors. I've had a terrible pattern in the past, not now. Luckily, I've healed. I have a beautiful husband now, but I used to just really keep getting into relationships with people who were not going to treat me well or be there for me, whether it was because they were addicted, married, didn't love me, period, had major problems. It was just always like some terrible problematic thing. And I would have this ridiculous, okay, I'm not going to make fun of it. It's not ridiculous. It's neurological. My bonding mechanism would just sort of like occur, whether it was somebody I liked or not. I would just get all bonded. And then I felt stuck in relationships. And because of the abandonment trigger, I couldn't leave, and I just threw away so many years like stuck in bad relationships.
I get it. That abandonment thing is just well, I just recently discovered trauma bonding and the concept of trauma bonding, and so I'm starting to read of that, and I'm like, I mean, again, I was like, oh my Lord, yes.
Yeah, it's like my kryptonite. It's like it gets near me, I'm like, I can't think, I can't act, I have no agency.
Yes. Yes.
So that was, and so that's a big part. So my first course, so I was going to write a book, and then I just wrote this on ACEs Connection today in a response to somebody. I thought it would be a book. I've written self-help books in the past, but I remembered that with my PTSD, when it's active, I can't read books. I can read paragraphs or little things, or I can listen to things, but I can't read a book. It's like way too much concentration for me. And I realized it needed to be a lot of little short bursts of information, like a blog. And I realized videos were going to be good for people who take it in through their ears. And I started doing cartoons because I hate stuff that's really heavy. Like I read books that are like, and if you had this many adverse childhood experiences, your chances of autoimmune diseases go up 20%. And I'm like, I just get so bummed out. I can't really handle it.
Right.
So I started putting silly cartoons in there. It's just kind of making fun of tragedy. And I'm happy to say my drawings are starting to become a little better, a little more legible. And some people love the cartoons, and some people are just like, you should really get some drawing software. These are terrible. So I just sort of go, well, I have about 4 hours a week to post. And so I just can't afford to be a great artist.
Right.
I'm a crappy artist and a crappy childhood.
It goes with the crappy childhood fairy. So there you go.
It does. I do what I can, and it's been so fun. So I'm working on a series of courses, and the first one I've called Healing Childhood PTSD. It's about 3.5 hours of video. There's a workbook, and about the first third of it is all about the science of ACEs. It's I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I'm just a person who's read a lot about it and tested out a lot of stuff. I'm talking from my own experience and summarizing it. And so I sort of go over what we know. And in real life, when I start talking to people about this, I'm sort of this like promotora. I try to educate people when they resonate with it and get them started and tell them what to read and send them to ACEs Connection. And then there's this, so now I have this course out there online. I have a blog. The blog, I've got like 60 posts about this. It's covered with videos and downloads and things. Sometimes I write about it. Sometimes I put a video out there about it. Just talking about the science, but then I also veer into sort of personal essays about what it was like to grow up poor, what it was like to have a hippie mom who had poor boundaries, some personal essays. And then I sort of have this like, I'm your teacher thing, and I teach techniques to re-regulate. And I'm on this drumbeat trying to encourage people to learn the tools that you can have all by yourself, whether or not you have access to professional help, whether or not you have access to a doctor who has any idea what you're talking about, whether or not your family is around you still doing this to you, or if you're free of it yet, you can have these tools. I teach these tools that will help re-regulate. A re-regulated person has choices.
Yes. Yes.
So that's the key. Some people think that maybe I'm promoting too much, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And I don't mean to say that anybody can ever live life alone in any way, but the tools in your pocket, because I'll tell you, recovering, it does sometimes involve shedding a lot of the people you used to rely on.
Yes.
And until you find the new people,
yes.
So sometimes it just is you and your pencil and paper.
But there's an empowerment to that. And like if you
Yes.
scroll all the way down to the first page of my website, there's a little kid in a superhero cape. You know, it was a photo that I picked from the stock photos because I wanted it to be about people learning to be their own hero. And that's what you're saying, is that, you know, whether, you know, I went through EMDR therapy again, like we should be friends because we've traveled a lot of the same journey, and EMDR was life altering for me. However, it took so much more than just EMDR. It was learning and educating myself and reading everything I could get my hands on about brain plasticity and you know, again, the Body Keeps the Score and all of those books, but then books like Brené Brown's, you know, The Gifts of Imperfection. And I mean, I was just flooding my head with all this information, and then teaching myself meditation and going to yoga and taking nature walks, and again teaching myself about it because there was an empowerment to that. And so, yeah, I think it's beautiful what you're doing, teaching people that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, I just really want to express thanks and gratitude, both gratitude and respect to everybody out there who's teaching what they know, who's figuring things out and teaching what they know. This really is a revolution in human consciousness.
Right.
And I see that I look back, like I was looking at, there's that, I'm afraid I don't know what it is, but there's like a excavation in China where there's all these ceramic soldiers, like hundreds of these soldiers. Have you ever seen pictures of that? I've never been.
It looks like, yeah, like like a trench, and they're
Teri, they're marching. Why do soldiers march? Because going left, right, together with other people regulates the brain, which you really need after you've been in a battle, right? People have known things about this, singing together, marching together, dancing together. People have figured this out intuitively, even if we haven't had an MRI of what's happening when we use those tools. So for me, writing, the big tools for me were writing. I write my fears and resentments twice a day. I happened to learn this from a woman who was in AA. I'm not an AA. I'm not an alcoholic, luckily, just by the luck of the draw. But she said, when I was in great distress, she just said, do you want to see how I got sober? I'm like, yes, I'll do anything. And she showed me how to get my fears and resentments on paper. And as a result of the experience that I had when she showed that to me, I had a really strong spiritual experience, and I continue to be a spiritual person. And I try to teach this in different languages, in a sense of like, if you're spiritual, you can ask God for help with this. And that's how I do it. But I'm also a very science-oriented person. And scientifically, it totally holds up.
Right.
There's different languages or lenses you can look at this. So, and then there's the practical thing, and we're learning so much more about connection and how important that is, both for our neurology and for our physiology and for our psychology, and just to be happy. You know, people are so lonely. I think loneliness is the terrible curse of the world. And
I just read a post recently on ACEs about that, and it was directed towards teachers, and I shared it on, you know, my Facebook pages and social media, and because it spoke to me so much, and it was talking about the loneliness factor with children and how teachers can address it, with kids. Yeah,
and it's this great thing. Like, if anybody's ever wondering, what can I do today to help the world? It's like, just remember that everybody's lonely. Practically everybody's lonely. Like, we go on Facebook and we focus so much on the people who are like, here I am with my avocado salad and all my beautiful friends. And you think, I'm just sitting here on Saturday night with nothing to do.
Right.
It's so painful. Well, I'm somebody who loves to have potlucks. And part of that is I love to have my house. I have a family now. I have my own family. But I love filling up the house with people. I love being unlonely. I love reaching out to people who may be lonely. I go to Toastmasters. I'm working on my public speaking for the Crappy Childhood Fairy. That's one of my next steps, is to be doing more public speaking. And my Toastmasters club, I'm like, everybody, potluck at my house.
We're going to have a potluck. We have movie parties. We do parties all the time. I have euchre clubs. I so get it.
Yeah. And everybody, like in Toastmasters, for instance, if anybody watching doesn't know Toastmasters, it's an international club for practicing public speaking. And everybody who goes there is trying to take a step up in their life. We have a woman who just moved to the United States from Iran because things were getting very rough over there for her and her family. We have students who have never been able to get up and talk in front of people. We have 80-year-old women who are in charge of things at their church, and they want to be more effective as speakers. Like, there's every kind of person in our group, and everybody's taking a step up. And my heart just warms up having a potluck and saying, let's go around the circle and tell us what you're working on. And it just feels so good. And gosh, don't tell my Toastmasters group that I'm secretly so touchy-feely, but I just know, like people are going through a lot of trauma out there,
right?
And we can be that. We can be Grandma Ree. I'm not that old.
Yeah.
I'm not a grandmother. I have teenagers, but
right. So,
but I want to be like her.
the next question, which is, who is your target audience? Who do you want your target audience to be?
Well, it's interesting. So I thought women were my whole thing. I've started, and I didn't tell you, so my next course that's coming out in December, it's all about relationships and dating. And this is kind of my special subject that I've been holding back in my back pocket. I can't teach you about relationships till you learn how to re-regulate.
Right.
So my first course was about that. Now I'm coming out with the relationships class. And when I started posting about that, I had such a warm, enthusiastic reaction from the folks out there. And now I'm seeing the men show up. And I was like, that is so beautiful. I guess I had a bad idea about men just from my, like having boyfriends in the past and thinking they don't care about me. Men totally care about relationships, and they want to be better at them. And they are now half of the people who respond to everything that I put out. I'm really excited about that. So I've just kind of changed my vision about who this is for. So that said, when I look at who looks at my stuff, it tends to be people who are between about 35 and 55. I think you have to be 35 to realize how bad maybe 30, I was 30, like you think that maybe if you just find the right person or you get the right job, life is going to fix you. That's obviously not true. Like, some people know exactly what's going on quite young, but the audience gets a lot bigger about 30 when people have tried everything and they're still looking. But then I have people, I got a letter from an 88-year-old man in England last week, and he signed up for the course, Healing Childhood PTSD, and he wrote me a long email, very articulate, beautiful letter, saying how much this had touched him. It was the first time anybody had really seemed to understand how neurological it is. Yeah. And he, too, was sick of having it psychologized. Things like, when people say, oh, you must really want to recreate your childhood. And I think, I guess so, but I don't think so. Right. I think I'm trying to create like a good life.
Right.
I'm not
back there.
I'm not crazy.
Right.
I keep finding myself having the same like bad crap happen over and over again. And I don't know why, but I'm not crazy. So he felt heard for the first time. And he said, I just wish I had more time to change my life. So that was pretty cool. And then I've had teachers. Yeah. I'm getting a lot of letters from teachers saying, could you adapt this for high school kids? So that's on my to-do list too. Yeah. It needs to be a little simpler and not so self-disclosing, I think. And I'm probably going to need to consult with people who can teach me about like, how do you present stuff to kids and what's a good format for that? But that's coming up next. And then the third big course that I plan to do next year is all about working. I think relationships and work are a lot where people with childhood PTSD can get bungled up. Like having a boss, having to deal with money, feeling thwarted. not getting the education that you really were capable of having too much ADHD type symptoms or depression to handle the education or the work experience. And so I think I can really help people with that. When I first got techniques to re-regulate, even though I didn't know that's what it was called, I went from this very low paid job to all of a sudden I just said I should be in grad school, and I got into grad school at UC Berkeley like within a year. It happened really fast. I just my ability to, my presence of mind, my intelligence, and my ability to act on my own behalf had just went up so exponentially when I learned to re-regulate.
Yeah.
There was so much potential locked in there. And so from what I understand, something like 15% of the world, who knows about that, has childhood PTSD.
Yeah.
It's hard to measure, but let's assume it's 15%. That's how many people have that much potential locked up inside them.
Right.
And maybe with all the problems we have in the world, we have a lot of good in the world, but with the problems, maybe it's those 15% of people's skills that would be just the thing to lift us up into something better. And that's how important it is that you're doing this, that the whole ACEs community is doing this. Everybody's coming at it with their special background and knowledge and experiences. It's so positive.
It is so positive and very beautiful. So what, any myths or facts that you want to clarify? I know you've written a lot of books about that, haven't you?
Yes. I did a post last week actually, but I'll share it here for anybody who didn't see it. And it's 4 myths that we used to believe about the effects of childhood.
I read that, yes. Yeah.
I don't know if I can even remember them all off the top of my head. One of them is that people used to think that it wasn't even called childhood PTSD, that what was ailing us as people who had had a rough childhood was primarily psychological, that it was in the way we interpreted reality and felt bad. What we now know is that there's a neurological injury at the root of that.
Right.
So of course there's psychological harms, there's emotional stuff, of course there is, but at the root of that is a neurological injury. And luckily, we have some plasticity there, and we can change that. So it's just been my dramatic experience that when you address that first, dealing with the psychological and the emotional stuff becomes possible. Another of the things is that we used to think that what do you do when you have childhood PTSD? Talk about it, right? It's always like, oh, you really need to talk to somebody about that. Well, there was me. I mean, I just did so much therapy where I would come out of therapy and go sit in my car and sob and think, I don't know what I'm going to do because I feel even worse than when I went in there. All this emotion would come up. I'd be angry. I would feel just abandoned in life. And everybody kept saying, get a good therapist. And I'd be like, I just don't get it. Like, this is not helping me. And I remember seeing sometimes an expression on therapists' faces like, why is she not getting this?
Right.
I thought we talked about this, and I just seem to have this like wall inside. So that's a myth that talking, we now know that talking about it can be really triggering. And especially for those of us who had some stuff going on before we even had language, like in the first few years, talking about it can just sort of set off a whole bunch of physiological reactions that make it really hard to process or listen or be present or take action or think reasonably. And that sometimes there are other ways. Some people get it through movement. Writing is really important to me. I write my fears and resentments. Meditation is crucial to me. It's sort of, it boosts the power of the writing. I would never be able to just meditate if I didn't write my fears and resentments first, because like a lot of people, I just have too many hamsters running around in there.
Right.
So together though, I write, then I meditate twice a day. That works really well for me. And for it's not for everybody, but a lot of, I've helped hundreds of people with that. So talking isn't the only way. Once I'm re-regulated, I can talk.
Right.
And things are possible. So a third thing is that there's a belief out there that you have to do this through professionals. And as we know, like hardly anybody has enough access to professional help. Right. Even if you have great insurance, what do you have, 10 visits? I think in the UK they have 16 visits. So, and let's just pretend for a minute that all professionals know exactly what this is and how to treat it. Well, they don't. This is an emerging science. There's some at the cutting edge, And there's some who have no freaking idea what it is. And, you know, I had a doctor I said, hey, do you have any ACEs informed doctors on staff? And she said, I can refer you to the domestic violence clinic. And it was like, yeah, that wasn't the question.
No. Do you know what ACEs are?
They know, like they've been trained, but it's really not integrated. So at least they're getting trained. Like it's a start. Yes. It's a start, but it's not integrated. And really, we can't demand that everybody completely understand all things in the whole world. Some people are going to specialize. So anyway, the myth is that this all has to be through professionals. What we now know, and this is something I feel strongly about, is we can get a lot of recovery with techniques that we can just keep with us at all times. Pen and paper are my core tools. So even when I can't get help from another person or a friend, when I have to duck into the bathroom at a social event where I'm freaking out, I can go start writing my fears and resentments in the bathroom, wherever I am. I can do it in a business meeting if I must. Now everybody's going to see this, so they're going to wonder what I'm doing when I'm writing. But what I look like when I'm treating my PTSD is like this, like I'm taking notes. Cool, right? You know, it's very, very subtle, very private. And I'm getting that fear and resentment out, and it works for me. So we now know that independently, all by ourselves, we can be our own hero. As you said, you have the little superhero image. And, but yeah, to be clear, I really think we're born into community. We can never escape community. And of course, the love and connection is what makes everything possible. And that the childhood PTSD is an injury to our ability to connect. I mean, that's what it is.
Right.
That's what it is on a lot of levels. So connection is important, but we do have independent tools we can use. And then the fourth thing that's a myth is that I won't even try to articulate the myth. It's so complex. I'm just going to tell you what we now know. And I'm also going to say this is a lot of my personal advocacy. We get this brain injury, we get dysregulated, and from that dysregulation flow all kinds of self-defeating behaviors. And I think we have a hard time talking about that. The professionals don't want to talk about it because it sounds like blaming the victim.
Right.
And those of us who suffer with childhood PTSD may not be ready to talk about it. And especially if we are not feeling hopeful that we have any power to change this, it's shameful and we don't talk about it. But there's a lot of behavioral stuff that comes from childhood PTSD. I used to be a heavy smoker, for example. You know, I used to have these sick relationships. I've had complete craziness eating sugar. By the luck of the draw, it hasn't been drugs and alcohol for me. It hasn't been ADD per se, but it's been these huge emotional reactions. So I had my kids, I had children with somebody I wasn't married to. We sort of got married and we got divorced after 18 months. So I raised my kids as a single mom, and, you know, we made the best of it and my kids are wonderful. But that whole part of my life was very much driven by my trauma and my holding on to a relationship that wasn't very good. It's a complicated story because I'm really grateful for the kids, and I'm friends with my ex as well.
I run a business with my ex, so it's things have a way of working out, but that was a very trauma-driven decision to have kids with that guy at that time. And so I'm not putting myself above anybody, but I just see a lot of what we have going on, a lot of the, here's something people don't talk about. I worked in reproductive health care for many years, and there's just kind of this strange phenomenon where some people tend to have a lot of unintended pregnancies and some people don't. Why is that? And they used to just sort of say, oh, well, they're just like non-compliant or they're not getting enough education. But we now know, like, actually trauma plays a huge role. Like, you can have all the education and great birth control in the world, but if you're at the effect of your past trauma, your left frontal cortex shuts down around sex, well, using birth control can be really difficult. Or saying no can be impossible. Right.
And so
it's the boundaries part of it.
Yeah. And so I feel like there's a lot of conversations and work and personal development out there kind of waiting to happen when we can be more honest about this stuff, because we're not afraid that we're victim blaming or trying to paint social problems as like, oh, you see, it's all their fault. And I don't know, we're also afraid we're going to screw it up.
Right.
There's some stuff we're not talking about yet. And that's why as the crappy childhood fairy, I like to sort of stay on the fringes, and I talk about it. In my relationship course, I'm going to talk about those decisions about having sex and birth control. I'm going to talk about it. I don't have to, I'm not the employee of something, and I don't have to be licensed, and
Right.
I can shoot from the hip a little bit and just say, this is my experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. So one of my favorite questions I love to ask people, since we're running to the end here, and I told somebody the other day, I said, I wanted to compile a book when I, like, this is podcast 48, I think. And I love the answers I get on this. So if you could meet anyone, dead or alive, who could help you with your journey, with your mission, who would it be?
This would be a weird answer. Laura Ingalls Wilder.
All right. It's not a weird answer.
I have 20 people I could name, but Laura Ingalls Wilder was this profound influence on me as a kid. And her family was they were in these really terrible straits, and they stuck together. And I lived in a fantasy world that I lived in there. I was an Ingalls. I was the 5th Ingalls daughter.
Right.
And I built, this was before you could get these dresses. I would make them with Scotch tape and fabric, that I got at a thrift store, and stapler. And for shoes like Laura, I got ice skates and took the blades off and walked around. They have a very rigid bottom. You clump around like Frankenstein. And
Yeah.
I had a bonnet. And what I got from that, Laura Ingalls Wilder is this beautiful poet of going within to find that natural strength that we all have. And her family taught it to her, but then she had to sort of draw it out of herself. And I recently read the great biography of her by Carolyn. I can't remember her last name. I want to get that right. Anyway, you can take this out, but
No, that's fine.
I read this beautiful biography of her that was one of the best books I ever read about how she carried on with her life. And, their situation was really traumatic, but the family was strong. And by writing about it so beautifully, when you write about something and you put it out there, it becomes timeless, and other people can access it and receive it. And so when you're doing this blog, and I'm writing on my blog, and I don't know if I can come up to the standard of her. I don't know. She was just like this ordinary person, and something happened where she wrote this incredible series of this literature. And do you know they used it in Japan after World War II? She became a national hero of Japan, and the government distributed it to kids to help them understand the experience of hardship and carrying on.
Wow.
And this was, in people who had been directly affected by the atomic bombs. You can imagine how traumatized these kids were. And these were the books that the government shared with them to say, you can carry on. And she had this strange Japanese fan base of people who were like, so you do understand what I went through. And when I read that, I was like, me too. That's Mr. Rogers, Laura Ingalls Wilder. There were people who kind of had my back, like, across time.
Yeah.
So
But
I could probably.
what I see from those two examples is just very gentle, just calming nature kind of people. Yeah.
Making the butter.
Yeah, right. Taking the shoes, taking the sweater off, hanging the sweater up. Yeah.
Yep. Twisting the wheat. Yes. All right. Well, thank you for having me, Teri. It's been so fun talking to you.
Yes, it's been absolutely beautiful. I did have one more question, which is, what is your dream job, and are you doing it?
Yeah, I'm doing it. I wish it were my full-time job, actually. I love making videos. It's very creative, and it pays, and that's good. The Crappy Childhood Fairy pays for itself.
Right. Yes.
There's a small amount of revenue that pays the expenses, and that's very nice. But my dream job is to be able to do more of this, and I want to be out there speaking more about it and reaching an audience and having more contact with the people who are experts in their fields, doing this so that we can bring this to people faster and more completely. I really think there's a lot of human potential, and all my life I craved to do something that was meaningful, and I feel like in the last couple of years I found it. I found it. So as much as I can, I want to keep going.
Yeah, well, keep it up, because again, I love what you do. I love your cartoons, your drawings. I love the way you write. And I think I've responded to you before we had connected this way, via the podcast, to some of the things you've written, at least, and shared on ACEs Connection, because it's just, I love, because I write this way, that raw, real kind of writing. There's just, I just connect to it. And I think that's probably what attracts people to you, is you're just real, and it's raw and beautiful. So
in the age of social media trolls, it was a big step to decide to put my real self out there. And I will say I do get hate mail from time to time, but I get so much love mail that I can handle it.
Yeah. See you later, haters.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, again, thank you for what you do. So how can people get in touch with you? Where can they find you?
You can come to crappychildhoodfairy.com, and you can find all the resources there, the class. There's a quiz there about childhood PTSD, and a whole bunch of posts and videos about the stuff I think about. And you know what I wish people would do is write to me more often. Comment on things, send me emails. I love hearing from people. Let me know what you think and what you're doing. So yeah.
Okay, very cool. Well, again, thank you. I'm going to do a little sign out here. Everybody, thank you for joining us today. And until next time, remember to be gentle with yourselves.
Bye, Teri.
Bye-bye.